that we are going live. So hello, everybody. Welcome to the fourth speaker series that's being hosted by Dynamic Rentals. I'm Austin Rios. I'm very excited to have our guest, Gary Adcock, today, talking about technology and equipment and all the great tools and resources that our industry uses to propel us into the future. And I think it fits along well with a lot of the previous discussions we've had with manufacturers and being able to tie that story together. And Gary's is really an industry vet. He's a workflow and technology architect. He designs, kind of the future of motion picture and, television production and post-production. And many of you know him from him being a regular speaker at NAB dating back to the 90s. So we're very, very excited about that. To give you guys, those who are new to our channel and new to our team, Dynamic Rentals is a camera and production equipment rental company. We specialize in sub-rentals. It's all we do. We rent to other rental companies, and we partner really with other companies to have them view us in our inventory as an extension of their own. I'm joined by Brandon Zachary, our CEO. I'm joined by Tom Smith, our global head of sales. Joined by Sean Sims, our Chief Technology Officer. He's going to have lots of great questions to ask Gary. And I'm joined by Coda, our junior tech in our Atlanta office. So welcome, Coda. And then, of course, the lovely Anna Schmidt, who has been excellent putting these together and has been excellent bringing this to life and making sure that this is possible and that we continue to build these avenues for discussion. So, Gary, without further ado, do you want to kind of take it away?
Well, thank you. I'm glad you all are here today. We want to talk about a little technology and a little history and kind of tie in some of the other speakers that you've had as part of the Dynamic Speaker Series. So let's get going here. I'm just a guy. It's like I have to think about my own self. I'm a workflow consultant. I've said I've been doing all this kind of stuff. Things that people know me for are I'm the co-author of the camera comparison chart. It's one of the most well-known documents in the current rental industry, and it's kind of fun. And lately I'm a contributor to the 10th version of the ASC manual. I'm really proud of that, to be able to get in and help. But we want to understand where we came from. And I want to start in the beginning. A lot of people don't think about how we started in motion pictures. And the first ones are in the 1830s. We're talking before the Civil War. We started doing with rotating still film on drums that they tried to do. And it became an issue where people didn't really understand some of the things that were being done. I mean, you're talking about stroboscope and zeotrope. Those are pretty common names, but this is one of the earliest films that exist. There is a single frame of this film left here of the Roundhead Garden scene in 1888. It was one of the first times they did. And they'd actually gone through and created a strip of gelatin that they glued together and then used chemical process on, just like we would do nowadays with an acetate base. But it was gelatin. It was very, very fragile, and people didn't think about that. And as we went on with moving pictures, this is one of the most famous images in all time. Edward Meyerabridge showed this of a horse. This is 1872. And it's 24 5x7-inch cameras shooting glass plates to get this image. It's funny because I put the line on the bottom in the end because people didn't realize that 3 horses were actually killed in the process. They would trip, working out how hard the wires were, how things were being shown. They didn't really have the same kind of sense for animal rights or protecting, the performers that we would nowadays. So I always think about that and remind myself that there's a price to be paid for any movement to new technology. But as we do this, we have to think about how this keeps progressing over a period of time. This is 1890. These are the only 10 frames, and there were actually 10 frames. And this is kind of interesting because the Donisthorpe used a paper-based material. Rather than using an acetate film, he actually used paper, and they projected through the paper and the paper became the diffuser from the candles and things of the time. So it was kind of interesting to see some of these technologies and things that survived. And the really fascinating part to me about film technology is that in the early days of film, it wasn't uncommon for motion pictures to be on, 3-inch, 4-inch wide film rolls, because it was much easier to make a gelatin emulsion that wide. It was much easier to make a sturdy product that they could use for motion pictures. And you don't think of those kinds of things in the same way because of how we work on technology today. I mean, there's not that many of a current generation of upcoming filmmakers that actually even work on film anymore. So there's this mystique about film that I always like to talk about when it is. Edison famously quoted at 46 frame rates, but I've done some work with Douglas Trumbull and others in the other, and I'm think it's much farther. I think it's closer to 72. But it's interesting that when The Hobbit came out, it actually came out in 48 frames, which was very close to Edison's original 46 frames for the perfect optimal framing for human vision. And I always look at those analogies and think that's pretty interesting. But it was really silent pictures that brought a bunch to us. And it was interesting for the aspect of, we wouldn't have gotten to where we are today if it hadn't been the transition from silent pictures to film. But it's also the expressions that we have that came up. Overcrank and undercrank are really common terms. And I always used to tell students when I have classes that it's like, well, overcrank was they got up in the morning and they their arm was fresh and they'd had a lot of coffee. So they went cranked a little faster. And in the afternoon, when the sun was bright and everything, they were tired, they'd had too much to eat for lunch, and they were cranking a little slower. And the movie played faster. So they got slow motion in the morning and high speed in the afternoon, and they never quite, it took a while for those two concepts to become reality in this. But it was the advent of sound that changed everything. And people forget about the first sound on film was shown in the beginning of the 1900s. But it wasn't until the jazz singer came out in 1927 that things really defined. And that was also the point pretty much where we defined what was going on and the frame debates about the economics of filmmaking. Early animation things were 12 to 15 frames, sometimes 18, but that was it. It was interesting how they gauged it out, and it got down to, as it always does in motion pictures, it got down to, what does it cost to produce? What's the cost for the stock? What's the cost for the processing? How much can I afford to do it? And how little can I get away with? So filmmaking really hasn't changed a whole lot. And we don't think about it that way. We don't think that filmmaking has changed as much as it has, but in all honesty, the business side of it, it's still business, and we need to remember that. I'm known for the camera comparison chart, but really why this is up here is because we have this issue with sensors nowadays. There's sensors of all different sizes. We've got everything from, the Super 35 that we started with to, Alexa 65, and we've got LF and Red VistaVision and, all these other ones. I like to note that Sony's Venice is probably is the closest to VistaVision of any actual sensor. I mean, the Super 35 sensors in the area LF and Sony stuff are pretty accurate for the size of Super 35. But beyond that, the sensors are all over the place. And this creates a problem. I mean, a good problem, but a problem, because now we're dealing with so many different image formats and resolutions in the chips. Companies like Netflix are starting to protest. And we need to think about that as we move on. And it's surprising to me. I'm going to show some, these are from lights. I've been lucky enough to work with a number of different manufacturers over the years. So I like to include their content with my slides. But this is an example that we showed at NAB a couple of years ago when we first started having the discussion about full frame lenses and full frame optics. And you start seeing that, the first one was a Super 35 at 50 millimeters. Now we have a Canon C 700, which is a little broader format, a little closer to a 35 millimeter traditional, still 35 millimeter film frame. And you see that even though it's a 50 millimeter, it shows a little more area in it. And this is one of the interesting aspects of how optics work is that the larger the image circle is, the more area you fill, the wider the image looks. And we don't think about it that way. A 50 millimeter lens is a 50 millimeter lens is a 50 millimeter lens. Now, a 50 millimeter anamorphic looks the same vertically, but not the same horizontally. But a 50 millimeter lens on a micro four thirds camera is the same as a 50 millimeter lens on a optical properties as a 50 millimeter lens on Super 35 or in full frame or larger. And that's one of these properties that we need to teach and learn, because it's fundamental for the next generation of filmmakers to say, well, I need a 50 millimeter lens for this camera. It's like, well, do you need a 50 millimeter lens or do you need a 50 millimeter point of view, field of view? So we have to think about those kinds of things. And there's lots of different ones. Here's a Monstro, here's Venice, and there's the Alexa 65. Now, this is when it gets interesting, because this is basically half of a 2 1/4 frame. I grew up in still world, so Hasselblad was a square image that was 2 1/4 inches. It was 6 by 6 inches, and this is 6 by 4 5. And it's interesting because you 2/3 of the frame, you got the same kind of image quality and got that nice perspective for it. And we never thought about it the same way. A grid overlay with some of the sizes of the existing imagery so you can see. And I just want to give everybody some ideas on that and show them some of the issues that we're having. These are the things that you run into when you start trying to match a Super 35 and feature work. This is Super 35 framing, and the concept of this was actually to match between a Super 35 and a VistaVision camera. And what you got is, and you can see if I go back and forth with these, that the woman's in the relatively the same space, but the look of the image is different. The VistaVision gives more depth. It appears to be a wider angle, even though it's the same framing size. And we have to think about that. And when you look at them together, they don't seem to look that separately until you start looking at the background elements. If you look at the VistaVision shot, the elements in the background appear farther away. They appear more, there appears to be more depth. And that's because you're filling the maximum image circle on the sensor with the larger red VistaVision size that gives you that spatial separation. It adds to the three-dimensionality of it. And that, along with the depth of field, is why people have gravitated towards these large format sensors. That and the fact that a whole generation of filmmakers have come up working with DSLRs, and the digital DSLR kind of changed filmmaking for all of us. It brings up some interesting topics, and we get to do some fun things that way. I support a lot of people. This is from stuff I borrowed from Matt Duclos, because we've done this session too. And I talk about lens charts, and I kind of remind people we need to think about how it works. Everybody always asks me, when I'm working with a lens that has very specific types of chromatic aberration, or I'm working with anamorphics, why is the top and bottom of the lens of the image area never affected the same way the sides are? I said, because it's a circle and you're not looking at half of the circle. And while that's a fundamental process in our world, it's amazing how many people don't think about that. Is that they assume that it's supposed to be, soft all around. Well, it is soft all around, but you're only using this much of the image. And if you're only using part of the image, the rest of that's not being shown. So that's why when you work with lenses that have specific kinds of chromatic aberrations or old, glass from period glass, you're not always getting the aberrations you want at the top and the bottom of the frame in the center, because you're not shooting that part of the circle. And it's just a thought, because it's how we have to go forward in all of this. And I kind of have some fun with that. Let me cut out of my, I'm actually going to do one more thing. This is a Panavision test chart. It's actually quite large, and I want to show something, because people looking at a chart like this, people don't think of how the framing works. So what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to drop in. The blue line is the Venice framing or VistaVision framing, on this Panavision chart. The red line in the center is the Super 35 framing for 178. And I don't think people look at that framing size the same way if they're not thinking about, how much larger the imager has at the same focal length. And And the only thing that's changing in these shots is the size of the imager. The focal length of the lens doesn't change. So that's kind of an interesting thing. But it's always really nice when you get to see it and you see something that actually covers to the edge of the frame. This was this is a macro lens for PL that actually covers all the way out to Alexa 65. So I find that kind of funny. I'm actually going to jump out of my app right now and get back to my screen share. Let me stop my share here. I've got to change my share is actually what I need to do. So I have to go in here and I'm going to share iPhone. Do you see that? Yes, you do. Okay, it's kind of grainy and kind of fuzzy. Oh, and of course, because it's a brand new device, iTunes wants to take over my account. So we're going to get rid of that. This is the IBE Smart Finder that I've been able to borrow for this process. And I want to show people some stuff. So with this, I can actually go through and choose a camera setup. Let me create a new setup here just so people can take a look at it. I'm going to select the camera. Let's just say, I'll take the Arri Alexa 65. I'm going to do 4K UHD just what it is. I'm going to select the lens on this. And I want people to look for a second to think of all the lens manufacturers that there are that produce lenses that we work with in a modern age. All of these companies have a lens. And, if I click on Zeiss here, these are all just the sub settings for Zeiss. I think there's 6,700 different lenses in this device. But what that allows me to do is go in and choose a lens. Let's just say, let's take, where were the Zeiss ones? Zeiss, acro 100 millimeter. And now I have a lens set up. Now I've got that lens set. But what I'm going to do here is let's just take a look at this. Let's go Alexa 65. Let's take a look out my window here. So what I'm looking at is that sitting next to me is, a Fujinon Promista. I've been working on some stuff on extended data, and I have a Fujinon Promista that I've been working on here, but I'm using it just as a set for the technology so everybody gets to understand what I'm doing. But this is the Alexa 65 sensor. This is that massive wide piece of glass that's in there. But if I go back and grab a different camera, let's take an Alexa Mini, go back here. Notice how it zooms in. Now we have the issue. It's like, now you see in real time the difference between a really wide format sensor, and you can see the compression difference. You can see the image scale difference. You can see how it looks. And that's part of this that's kind of interesting, because I don't think people realize how much the sensor technology is part of what we need to compensate for with multiple different kinds of lenses, multiple different kinds of cameras, and the workflows around them. And when you're dealing with rental properties, I mean, it's incumbent on us as the professionals to try and share some of this information. I need to jump back into my program here. Let me stop my share. I'm going to go back to my keynote. Yeah, I kind of jumped through a few things here. So it's 1 second. Let's see, screen sharing, desktop again, go back to that. And play. So now we're going to talk about the future of this. I lifted this image off the internet. It's part of some production stuff, but it's evident that the future of where we're going after this pandemic is going to be in virtual production and virtualized production. Now, this can be 3D sets built with, Unreal Engine 4, especially if you've seen the Unreal Engine 5, you know it's going to happen. It can be video walls like we did on The Mandalorian. But part of what's coming out of this new technology is the thrust for understanding data. And metadata in particular is a big part of this. I've been working on this project with Zeiss and Fujinon and Sony and Red and Angenu and everybody else. Ambient, I got a master time club clock here. I play with all this stuff. But it's tracking all of this lens metadata that's going to be a fundamental part of what we do in the future. And it's not just focus, iris zoom, it's manufacturing serial number. It's also distortion and shading characteristics. And this is the big time advantage for us. As we move forward, the technology that's going to allow the lens information to be passed directly to the cameras is going to make augmented reality and virtual production easier, simpler, and faster to execute on set. And while the Zeiss extended data is all based on the iCook technology, this could also be ARRI LDS and LDS2. This could be the Cook i3, Zeiss extended. I mean, there's a number of different ways to do this. But you know, Fujinon, Zeiss, Cook, Sony, ARRI, Red, everybody's involved in this, and it's important. But you need to think about what this is. This is actually a shading math, and this is a little tiny snippet of what we're doing to try and explain to you of how the shading actually goes on. And notice that one says distortion, the other one says shading, but this is actually a real-time mapping of a lens. That, think about what this means for virtualized production. I can now access the shading elements of the lens and the control of that, and be able to add it to the virtualized set or extract it from my camera data in real time. So now, with having this capability of handling the metadata dynamically in a virtual production, is allowing us to go to a new level. And this is for everything. It's for visual effects, it's for virtual production, stitching of cameras. People think about how the warping and shading issues may adjust overlap if you're doing a multi-scene panorama, or if you're doing something that requires plate work, or anything that has to do with volumetric and 3D acquisition. So the data that comes from this is a very important part of the process. And capturing and handling this data is fundamental to making the next step for this virtualized production. Zeiss extended data works on cameras. The only requirement that you really need to have is you have to be able to access the time code. So I have a master locket. It's a real nice little box. I have it here. It records the XD data in real time. I can use Pomfret Live Grade to be able to see that information live on screen. So I can actually apply the real-time data and adjust information on screen when I'm doing a grade. I can use Pomfret SilverStack to be able to do the sidecar files. So in the case of if you were using a trans video monitor for one of these, this actually got a little SD card that it records to, whereas the ambient box actually just records internally in the internal memory. But all of this allows you to capture and then pass this sidecar data to post for insertion. And that's the important part of this is that people are involved in this at this level. Red's DSMC2 and Red Ranger cameras they embed it inside the R3D format. Sony's Venice camera embeds it in the OCN formats. So you get this capability of having the lens metadata embedded directly in the master camera files. If you do the sidecar files, there's an EXR injection tool that actually allows you to inject the metadata into an EXR sequence file. And that way it's embedded in the file and you don't have to worry about it anymore. And then any 3D mapping or any kind of work done in post automatically does that. And I'm working with Fujinon because they're using one of the latest XD implementations. And it's interesting to kind of play with this. eFilm is up there because they're one of the first post houses that's actually started supporting this technology and allowing us to work this way on set. Like I said, Red Ranger, DSMC2, Sony Venice, they basically need the most current software updates for them. You can extract the files for After Effects and Nuke. There's a couple of other applications coming that are going to support things. I was talking to Joshua Davies, who runs FX Home. He runs a nice little funky app called FX Film. And he's going to start supporting it to CERN too. I know that Imagine Products is in discussions to be in it. So there's a number of companies that are going to support the data. But really what this is about is handling and manipulating the data so that we make the most realistic pictures possible. The video walls here for The Mandalorian, kind of changed the way we thought we're going to think about production and how that production literally went mobile in front of us. And that's is the big part here, because all of this data makes our life easier. It makes the shoots easier. It makes the data collection easier. It makes everything simpler because we're maintaining a sequence. And the reality of it is that whatever we do on set has got to get to VFX or it's no good. We have to be able to maintain the workflow all the way to post. And we need to make sure that we maintain that continuity. It's the hardest thing in the world. I mean, we all know how little camera reports are, regarded in the industry and how often they actually get to a post guy. Being a DIT, I know this series. But it's kind of interesting that people don't think about that kind of knowledge and think about those kinds of issues. And now we're doing things that don't necessarily fall in a traditional post workflow. We have to think about that. And it's those non-visual effects applications that are, that are the part. It's virtual production while still visual effects is real. It's real time. And to be able to do that for motion capture rigs or anything else is fascinating to me in that environment. I worked a long time ago with a company that worked on rotating iris technologies for 3D, about how to make more accurate left eye, right eye data. And that's part of where I got started in some of the metadata for shading of lenses and all of that. But I'm really fascinated with the volumetric capture capabilities of this, because as we move into the future with augmented reality and the level of interaction between camera, object, and viewer is only increasing. I mean, you look at people like Matt Workman in Boston, who's been doing virtualized set, and they're doing their camera tracking and data by strapping a Vive rig on top of the camera and making it work as the indicator of where they are in space. And for right now, it's working really good. It's great for, simple little things to stream online, but for us in the motion picture business and for doing, faster production for television, we'll need more accurate data at that level. And this is the next step of all of this is moving this data to a new line. We're in a brave new world right now, and there's so many things that can actually go on with it. It's fun for me to be able to, enjoy the technologies and look at it. I'm thankful to Fujinon for the assistance I get, and IBE Optics and Sony and everyone else that's helping out, and especially to Snehal at Zeiss, who's been really fundamental in getting me involved in all of this. Why don't we go out? Let me unshare my screen here, and we can do some questions, because I know everybody has them.
Oh. Thank you so much, Gary. Definitely, informing, certainly for me, a guy that didn't exist in this industry, while it was still film, but recognizing the importance and that lasting impact, the language, and how that technology really evolved over time is interesting. And I was having a conversation with somebody who wasn't in the industry over the weekend, and explaining to them a little bit about the data behind what's being communicated from the lenses to the camera, and how that makes a more efficient process as it relates to the post-production and keeping everything streamlined and keeping everything under one roof that is easy to collect and easy to understand. So very, very valuable. I'm sure Sean will have a couple of technical questions for you. I saw him, rigorously shaking his head a couple of times there.
Oh no, I want the nose. The nose are the ones I'm more interested in.
I'm interested in
Go ahead,
Gary. I think the nose sometimes can be a little.
Hey, you can't take the slings and arrows, my friend.
Right. Sean, did you have something you wanted to?
So yeah, Gary says, Austin alluded. One of the things we've been doing over the period of lockdown is we've been doing a lot of internal sort of workshops, training our tech. So we've got a various skill levels of techs and various ages. I obviously come from a film background myself, and love film for what it was and for what it is. Kind of had to go back to the fundamentals, go through the science of cinematography, kind of what we're talking about now. And we find ourselves going back to sort of Edison and why he chose 46 frames, and then kind of to getting to 48 frames, and kind of dialed into being 24, the cinematic frame rate that we all shoot at today, or also become accustomed to on our televisions. With film being a past and looking into the future, and knowing that The Hobbit was shot on 48 frames, do you ever think that's going to be the go-to frame rate coming down the line?
I look at frame rates, and that's actually the part of that I cut out of this, because with this kind of transmission, I can't effectively show 24 versus 60 frames on an internet feed, because it just doesn't work.
Of course,
but it's one of those things. It's one of those things that I still see. And I've had a discussion with a couple of people that are doing virtual production, that they still like the cinematic feel of 24. 25 in your land. And it's that filmic thing that defines us. It's also why the depth of field makes us feel differently, because it's the Sand and Sandal epics. It's Ben-Hur, it's Lawrence of Arabia. It's the films that define what the anamorphic, but also what widescreen was when it started. I'm kind of funny. I think sports looks better at higher frame rates. And I think what will happen is we'll start seeing times where we'll be able to watch shows based on the type of content. We'll see frame rates related to that. I really think that particularly motion sports, hockey, football, American football, those kind of sports, auto racing, F1 in particular, does really well with high frame rates at 60p or so, because you get so much more data, and it defines the motion of the performance of each individual artist. But I still like cinematic stuff. I'm still a 24 frame guy. I still shoot 24 for all my stuff. I force all my things to 24, even when they don't want to be. And it's just because that was what I grew up with. And I mean, I was a still guy. I grew up at a single frame at a time. So 24 is easy for me. The other comment I like to make about it, in a compressed world, there's another aspect of this too. If you're delivering a compressed file over the internet, 24 frames or 25 frames is 20% less than 30 frames, which is what your computer is spitting out. That means you can get a 25% better quality or 25% shorter content. So you can actually use the same kind of compression with less frames and get a higher quality deliverable. That's part of the concept of how that works as we deal with compressed files on the internet that people don't really pay attention to. It's one thing if you're looking at an OTA broadcast, which is being generated and consumed in real time. But if you're consuming something that goes on, YouTube or Facebook, you kind of have to fight them to get away from their 30p analogies. YouTube in particular wants to put everything at 30p. So, and even in PAL countries, that's the other thing. Even in PAL countries where it's 50 or 25, they want to push 30 because that's what computer monitors refresh at. And I'm sorry, I'm an American, and I still don't understand why televisions are in inches around the world.
Definitely.
Thank you. Yeah.
I don't get it.
Has us stumped as well. I just want to use this quick opportunity to remind anybody who's watching on our YouTube or Facebook channels, you can submit questions and we can get to them as we see fit. I know that the local team here also has a couple questions that they'd like to ask. So Brandon, do you have any questions that you'd like to ask Gary?
Yeah, I do. Gary, thank you so much for popping on with us. This is incredible. We greatly appreciate the history here that you presented and the knowledge and all the technology and the way that you see things going. I am kind of curious in terms of the structure and the way you see the industry heading. I think I can assume we agree that, our current global situation is in a sense igniting that shift, right?
Oh yeah, definitely.
Yeah. So do you also see that for all aspects of our industry? Obviously, we've thought long and hard about like the sports aspect, the live concert events. Do you see Netflix, for instance, Universal, the big shows that they have going on, kind of making a shift in that direction as well? Or do you see only certain aspects of the industry gravitating more towards that?
I think it depends on what they're trying to do. I mean, with virtualized production, I think you're going to see it more on the streaming channels for streaming. Netflix, Hulu, Apple TV will have the virtualized production first because they're much more attuned to change. Netflix is pushing lots of things and instrumental in a lot of what we're talking about here. They're not talking about it publicly, but we all know that everybody and anybody who's doing anything is all looking at how ways to save money, cut costs, streamline production. And especially now where we've had production cut off, there's a number of people looking at ways that they can use this kind of technology as shortcuts to be able to finish shows and do some of the things that they did before. as an industry, I think virtual production is still a couple of years off from being fully mainstream, but I see a point, and I've talked to a couple of people about this, where you'll start seeing virtual production stages pop up, where it'll be, 3,000 or 4,000 square feet of space that's all electronically controlled in time, so that you can walk in and actually do a performance capture or a camera capture that relates directly back to a live performance. And it's interesting because I have seen in a couple of instances people looking at a virtual performance where the cinematographer and the actress were in two different places. So he was using an avatar of the actress there to shoot her, and it was in real time. The Unreal Engine was modifying the lighting and tools on her to show the perspective from her. And I think that's going to be an interesting thing to look at. I think it's still 4 or 5 years from being enough to where it's fungible for a business standpoint. But right now, I think companies like NVIDIA and some of the other ones who are really working in the background of this ray tracing technology and how they're doing it are really changing the marketplace. And I can't, I haven't had a chance to work with him yet, but there's a guy, the DP in Boston by the name of Matt Workman. Cine Database is his handle online. And he's doing some really amazing stuff. I mean, he's strapping a Vive to the front of his camera and using it as a reference point to be able to do these very sophisticated virtualized productions on virtually no money. We haven't found a way to make that possible for higher end tools yet. And I think that's the next step we're at, particularly as we start moving into this issue with augmented reality and being able to handle some of these things in real time.
Yeah.
Did that answer it?
It did, absolutely. Yeah.
So there was a question too. I didn't see that.
Yeah, we got a couple of questions coming in from the audience. I'll start with one we got from Barbara Haller, New Pro Video. She asked, do you see that the interruption we have, all gone through, I think she's alluding to the virus, is going to slow down this transition and this kind of shakeup? At least the entire rental community has definitely felt, hey, large format, it's on the forefront. Let's start investing. We're buying lots of full frame glass. Certainly we have. Do you think that, this is going to slow that, that period of change down?
Well, that's a good question. I don't know. I'm not a soothsayer. Do I think it will? I think what's going to happen is that in the near term, it might be limiting as people start getting back into production and we start building things up, because the supply chains have been broken, and we all know that getting certain things like USB microphones and things like that are almost impossible right now. Trying to buy a Blackmagic switcher to do this was near impossible. but you don't think about that in terms of it. But I think in the near term, it might be slow to catch up. But I think by the time we get into 2021, certainly mid-year 2021, that there's going to be a definite push towards this evolving technology. Because if you look at extended data with a zoom lens like the Promistas, you now have this ability to make it a variable prime in a work, in a virtual environment that handles an extreme ranges of lenses that's just a single piece of glass. And by mapping all of that and being able to control all that in real time, we have the ability to directly feed the interfaces and I/O on everything. And that's what I look at as all of this. The lens data stuff, I think, is just the next step in all of this. And we've been fighting for time code for years, and we still don't have that right. But the other part of all of this, and why all of this is a big deal, is the changes to broadcast. The SMPTE 2110 specs have now started setting up that video, data, and audio don't necessarily need to come at the same time or the same place, as long as they marry at the endpoint. And now if you start getting the ability to insert data from any location within the specific timeline to an individual or at a place, determining GPS coordinates and that person, you're talking about Minority Report. And we're literally getting to that point where we can insert, commercials and specific data in your feed at your house on a broadcast signal. That's what the market's coming to, and that's augmented reality, and that's what we were talking about with in Blade Runner and Minority Report and all these movies that do that. And when we start getting that kind of data, that becomes so much more efficient for the next Marvel movie or the next Jurassic Park movie or something where you're using a lot of things that aren't normally there. And you use that same data for that purpose. I mean, I really think you'll start seeing extended data and the lens data stuff come up on visual effects films much faster as we start rolling back into production, because there's going to be so much work that has to be done and so few people. They're going to try and find a way to accelerate the process any way they can.
Very interesting. And I think too, Gary, just on that perspective too, there's all this new technology that companies were investing in, and there's all this stuff that's being demanded, right, by the creators of this content and this new age. And in some ways, we're going to be at this stalemate with, two different groups where, hey, some groups are going to be demanding this latest and greatest, and obviously the hands-off technology and the technology to be able to operate this stuff remotely. The demand for those types of equipment is going to tremendously increase. But the sort of nice to have, this would be cool if it was on our set. I think it's going to take a long time for that sort of thing to to take off, because rental companies specifically aren't going to be as willing to invest as they maybe would, 3-4 months ago. So there's such a push and a pull.
Your capital's gone to staying open, not investing in the future. That's and there's going to be periods of that, and we're going to learn to work on stone knives and bear skins for a little bit to go through some of this. I mean, there'll be workarounds. We will find ways to do that. It's the foam core and duct tape analogy. It only needs to last for a little bit until we're done with it, and then it can go away. But I think the technology is right, and I don't think everybody's going to be jumping towards the future right away. But those that are and those that need to will. And that will be the interesting part about this, to see how many people start pushing this technology. And I expect to see it in small places first. I don't expect it to see it as much in LA as I do looked at it in Atlanta for what's going on there. I expect to see it in Detroit more than I would anywhere else. I mean, you already see some of the virtualized production already. You look at the so-called Blackbird car that's got all the targets on it. They can change the wheels on, and it actually you use it. Detroit uses it as a running vehicle for devices, so they get the wheels spinning right, and then they drop the 3D models on top of it. It's actually pretty fascinating in this whole process of virtualized production. And that was just the start of it. And they've been doing that for almost 10 years now, where they've faked cars, 3D modeled cars on car commercials that look real. I mean, now they're just doing it where they're adding it to real sets and real backgrounds. And so that's not any different than anything else. Let's see. What are some of the other questions there?
So we've got a couple coming in from Maximiliano Aponte. Hopefully I'm pronouncing that correctly. He's asking as a question, I think, as it relates to the frame rates and their cost. He's wondering if adding resolution and doubling that resolution ultimately doubles the cost, and perhaps what the implications.
It did when it was film. It doesn't when it's digital. The power needed to play Red's 8K VistaVision footage right now is not a whole lot more than period-wise based on what it was when it was just 4 or 5K. And that's one of the interesting things. It's a little more storage and more computing costs, but less cost overall. I mean, the cameras cost the same, the media cost the same, the lenses cost the same. So it's only just the data fields and handling the raw amount of data that's better. And a good example of that is how the data compressions have gotten so much more better. Why we've gone from H.264 to H.265 with, twice as powerful encoding gives us a higher quality at half the bandwidth. And that's kind of what Red's done with the way they're encoding their files too. So I don't think that you have to suffer so much with the pixel loss. The bigger issue with me as we keep growing in pixels is the displays can't keep up. I mean, there's not really an effective 8K display out there, and there's only a handful of really good 4K ones that can be used for mastering. That's a different story. As we start having display issues, now we have to deal with higher and higher resolution. I'm a firm believer in better pixels, not more of them. I will take an HDR image over anything, and I still remember the first time I saw an HDR set in a large box store, and I looked up and went, I want that one from across the room. And that's when I knew I understood HDR and what OLEDs and all of that was going to mean for that. So I much rather have a higher quality picture than more pixels to see. So, and I have an 85-inch set that I view on, so I'm not small.
And I think that's an interesting point. You talk about, where the holdups in the technology might be, right? You talk about the screen resolution, not being able to keep up quick enough with what the cameras and the lenses are ultimately able to produce.
Let me not do that. Half of the world views content on these. This is the standard for the generation that's coming next. They don't understand it the same way as we do. And it's not, and here's a perfect example of, we all consume a shitload of data on these things, but it's not my preferred viewing environment. So the other question he asked, just to hit with Maximiliano's one, is the difference between LDS and extended data from ARRI. The ARRI's lens data system is proprietary to ARRI products alone, and it can only be used on ARRI cameras and ARRI lenses and encoded in ARRI formats. The Zeiss extended data is opened up for that. It's actually based on Cook's i3 technology, is their version of extended data with a couple more fields in it. But Zeiss has decided to simplify the I/O process a little bit and makes it a little bit easier for external manufacturers to access the data and utilize it, which is why it's right now it's the thing, and it's free. That's the other thing too. The development costs for iData and Cook technology are free. They're good about doing that. I see he's got one more on there too.
Yeah.
Use of larger sensors, better digital negative, especially in low light. Actually, that's not true. The larger sensors are not necessarily better in low light. And the example I will give you is a Canon ME20SH, I think is the model number, but it's a 1080 camera that literally sees in the dark. I shot one a couple of years ago as a friend of mine from Canon loaned me one. And we set it in auto set, and we went around driving around Chicago facing into the setting sun after the sun had set. So it was 90 minutes after the sun had set, and we were driving facing west in Chicago, and I got some of the most beautiful imagery of lights on in houses and just the glow in the back of the sky. And it was so stunning. And I went back and looked at it, and it was 30,000 ISO. And because it's a 1080 camera and it's got really, really, really big, aperture for light gathering, it really took a beautiful image. And in 1080, it was just luscious. And it was one of those things that surprised me. Bigger sensors or larger format stuff doesn't necessarily mean more sensitivity. That's strictly a drive of the manufacturers and how well they do it. And it has to do with all kinds of crazy things like, the aperture of the sensor and, how it's being done and what kind of OPLF is on it and blah, 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 blah. And every manufacturer does it different. But you look at what Panasonic, Sony, Red, even ARRI have done with their, extending ISO on cameras, and that ISO is one of those things that I think it's just going to keep going. I'm a firm believer, and I'm a guy that grew up in the 25 ASA world, Kodachrome 25. I remember that. Oh, let's see. Limits for frame rate clap. Go ahead. Jump in, Tom.
I've been waiting patiently. Gary, brilliant presentation. It's always fascinating, I think, to look back on the history of how we've got to where we have now. My question was, in 20 years' time, what are people going to look back on this current era and say, they used to do what? Like, what do you think they're going to look back and say, I can't believe they used to do that? We look back at no sound on film and the early days of digital and 32 megabyte. What do you think it's going to be?
Well, I mean, you look at the technology around it, and even right now, because of the pandemic, look how much stuff is being done in mobile. And you look at the Lady Gaga ad that was shot on an iPhone. That's going to be one of the things that's going to define not so much cinematic production, but news. I think news is going to change fundamentally to a more mobile-based system. The other thing that's interesting about it too is that think about the new iPad with LiDAR on it. To be able to go into a room and scan a room and get a 3D scan of approximate space, sizes, measurements, and all that kind of stuff, just because of the way the technology works in the device, take that to the next level. I mean, you've already seen, if you're paying attention to anything, about how they're talking about Apple's glasses with LiDAR technology in that. And that LiDAR is actually going to do things like allow people, I mean, think of the application of LiDAR if you take out your sight, that it could be used for image finding, range finding. It could be used to assist the blind. It could be used to help firefighters and things in the dark. It could be used for military purposes. And you take that technology and go, hey, wait a second, I can wear that on a piece of glasses that are attached to a computer that was more powerful than any that existed on the planet when we put man on the moon 50 years ago. One of these has more power than all the computing power on the planet. And you take those two things together and think about it. Whereas I'm now seeing imaging in real time. I've got a heads-up display. I'm Tony Stark. For God's sake, I've got a device that's feeding me information and telling me what to do and talking to me in real time in a logical voice. That's closer than we think. And in 20 years' time, 20 years ago, we were still thinking Blade Runner was going to be the future, and LA would be clouded and fog and everything. The air's clean right now in Los Angeles, and it's been raining, which is even stranger. and you just have to think about it that way. The one thing about the pandemic that really, really bothers me is I'm somebody who's traveled a lot in my lifetime. I've spoken in 43 countries. I've got hundreds of thousands of miles, a couple of million miles, actually, air miles. And it's one of those things that I miss dearly. I miss being and interacting with people. I miss being in different locations and learning different things. And I think that desire for us to learn is always going to be there. It's always going to be part of us to learn.
I agree. And Gary, I have just one more question. So when we had
Oh, no, you only get one.
I've got to. When we had the tsunami years ago, that kind of push to digital and moving away from analog and tape was expedited because of the fact there was no, tape around to be able to shoot it anymore. What do you think is going to be the biggest outcome of COVID? What change are we going to see soonest that is either new or expedited because of the virus?
Well, don't forget, there's one other aspect of that I keep getting reminded every time I bring this up is that there was also a Writers Guild and a Directors Guild strike at the time, and that was the merge of SAG and AFTRA, because they had different rules for digital media than they did electronics, and so there was actually all of that, and then new contracts for everybody for digital media that made this avalanche of digital come. And I was on the foundational. I was one of the founding members of that group. I actually was the guy that was testing the first ProRes Alexa when it came to America. I had the very first ProRes Alexa, and I had it for about 6 weeks just to beat it up and say it, because I'd done a lot of work with Apple and other companies on ProRes. So I was beating it up for them. What does it mean? I think we're going to see more wireless. I think wireless is going to become an even bigger deal than it is, particularly when you start thinking about on-set monitoring and that. I mean, right now, that wireless technology allows us to social distance on set. I mean, wireless technology was original social distancing. You wanted to be away from the camera guy. You needed, and I'm always in a tent really far away because I'm a DIT. So I always try and keep me as far away from the actors and people as possible. But that's one of the big functions of this that I see is that wireless is going to become a fundamental aspect of it, whether it's streaming, direct streaming to the client because they can't be on set, as you do with Frame.io or something like that. I mean, look at the collaboration stuff with the Frame.io has, where you're actually all working in post together. So I think the nature of this, where we have to have 60,000 people in a building to be able to produce art, may be the biggest casualty in all of this. I think we'll start finding that there's more and more celebration and working apart. I think that'll also, hopefully, one of the things I see about this is that'll kind of add equality to the market. because if you don't have to interact with somebody or you're dealing with them electronically, you're less likely to be bothered if they speak a different language or work in a different place or a different gender or whatever. And that, I think, is my hope, that part of this will actually lead to increasing to the diversification of our industry, particularly with women and people of color, because it's a big part of all of this. And it doesn't matter anywhere you are in the world, it's bringing people in. And there's talent everywhere that doesn't get aspect because they don't look like me, And I'm fussy about that. I actually insist that my crews are pretty well balanced. It's fundamental to me to do that. So
that's a fascinating point. Thank you.
Yeah. Oh, thank you. Try to make sure I got all the questions here because the chat's up.
Yes.
Volumetric cinematography. Go for it.
Yeah. I'll leave that one to you.
Zach Hunter says, I've been excited for volumetric cinematography and virtual camera for a while now. Do you see this technology becoming more viable in a more boutique setting? Well, it is a boutique setting right now because nobody's doing it any other way. Matt Workman, DP, look him up online. I swear you'll start seeing his stuff and you'll go, wow, stone knives and bearskins. I mean, he's getting by with very, very consumer products to try and build a future. And that's great for the learning process, but it needs to fundamentally get to within the workflow of the technology as it exists for us to be able to handle it in the kind of tools that make it more viable for feature film and television production. It's not a boutique thing. I think it's going to be everywhere. Smaller pickups geared towards single actor pickups and everything else. Well, they're actually doing that now. The single actor pickups, that's actually been a big thing. And I forgot who it was. Oh, it was Jennifer Lopez. Just did something and I caught it online, but they were doing pickups for her next movie and they did all the shots that she needed to be where she was alone. So it was like an over the shoulder with, green screen where she's supposed to be looking at somebody in a bathroom or those kind of things. And it was real interesting that there, those kind of productions are going on. And you look at what, The Voice last night here in the United States, where they do the celebration there and it's all virtualized production because they're packing up kits and shipping it to everybody. There's going to be a lot of that for the near future. I mean, if anybody saw this state of California, the city of San Francisco released production guidelines for getting permits to shoot in San Francisco, that was actually fairly interesting to look at how big the crews could be and some of the technology. So as long as we're all working to that point, and as long as we're all focused on moving forward, we have to protect everybody, but we also have to work. And there's a lot going to come out of this, but we have to make sure everybody's safe. And that's always the most important thing. We have to protect our friends and our family and our employees. Virtual production allows a whole bunch of technology not to be there anymore. I mean, we used to do kind of the same thing with matte paintings. And you look at some of the way Chaplin built his funny sets where there are mirrors and matte paintings and everything else going on in that. And you start to understand that some of this is not really very new. We had to cheat in the old days to make something look right. We're not doing it any differently. We're just doing it electronically instead of doing it physically. And that means smaller places and smaller sets and that. So, I think there's going to be a lot of that. I really do think that that's the future for a lot of production is virtual. If nothing else, why do you really need to be driving around a neighborhood in a car to do process trailer stuff? And more process trailer stuff is being done in virtual rooms or LED walls because it's just more efficient. You don't have to worry about traffic. You don't have the police. You don't have insurance needs with hauling all that stuff around. And you're working in a sealed environment that accidents don't happen. And you don't have to worry about audio issues or, street lights or anything else. You fake whatever you need. And that's the advantage of some of this. It's also the disadvantage. We'll get into a plastic world where it doesn't necessarily look the same as the world around us.
Well, that actually gets to the question I have, Gary, is not the plastic world aspect, but just the virtual production side of things. Do you see standardization happening between studios and production companies when it comes to that? Like, for instance, you've got cameras that all have different varying sensor sizes, right? And we don't really have a standardized full format, right? It's, every manufacturer kind of has their own standard for full frame. Do you see that everybody's kind of doing their own thing? I feel like that's the sense that I get right now, but do you see it turning more into a standardized system for digital, capture?
Well, yeah. Let me just say that Sony's Venice is the only one that actually has an Academy-sized sensor. It's within 1% of this division. I'll leave that there. But I don't, the sensor size thing, the battle about sensor sizes, that's a manufacturing thing and how the data comes off. I just care how the data comes off. It doesn't really matter to me, is it a 4:3 sensor? Is it 6x9, 16:9? What kind of sensor is it? Those kind of things are less important to me than what it outputs. There's a lot of battle for 8K and all that kind of stuff. I believe that it will come. I don't think it'll come as fast as people think it will, unless it's driven by gaming. And if it's driven by the gaming industry, that's going to change a big part of this aspect. I've had the same discussion with the Netflix people too, and I've had the same discussion with, Apple TV people, the Apple TV Plus people that they talk about these very same different sources and solutions. It's why CI 4K or UHD things in the image, and I have a little bit more control on it. Do I really want to shoot 4 or 5 times the size to it? The concatenation of an image to get taking a big image and making. I like the variety, and I also like the way that camera manufacturers build sensors that do different things. I mean, we talk Arri sensor records very differently than a Sony sensor, very differently than a Red. About stuff is really, it's people that want to pick a fight for no reason other than to support their purchase decision that they want to make sure that our 6K, consumer grade camera.
It also helps your camera list, Gary. It might be a bit boring if they're all installed.
Well, that's true too. I like to. We actually started on a zoom lens chart.
I think we'll take one more question.
I lost you.
Sorry, I was just mentioning that I think we'll take one more question.
I was reminded of what the volumetric comment is. I've always been a big fan of watching the special features on DVDs or like on Disney Plus. They have extras. I just had like maybe some little behind the scenes goodies, and absolutely floored me was that they had a set of VR goggles on top of a Steadicam being operated by other superfluous people in there just to throw in their 2 cents. So I think it really speaks to how the 2 people in a room, because the whole intention of them using the Steadicam was to add that humanity and how we implement the technology into that artistry. I think like anything is possible, just it wasn't a question. It was more of a adding on to what was already said. But what see that happening more with smaller crews? Like, would you do?
I think we are. I think it's come to the point where we're going to have more of that kind of aspect to it. Will it be everything? No, because after a while, one else. But
right,
would I
be
able?
Human element.
Right, but would I be able to do something that could be inserted into an existing project? Sure. Pickups and those kind of things, I think are much easier. Does really big budget tentpole projects that he has actors go to their car and record, and he says, I probably got a minute or 2 of scratch audio in every movie I've ever done has been recorded on a phone in a car, and it makes it to the screen. And it's what we have, and it's incumbent on us to push the technology and the manufacturers farther, but it's also incumbent on the facilities and the studios to be able to be willing to go, hey, wow, this is cool. I can do this.
Yeah, they need to be able to vouch for it. Yeah.
Well, and then you look at stuff like Alita, where they went in and did all the capture on that and changed her eyes and all of that. That's the performance stuff is here now. It's just a matter of marrying the virtualization in. And anybody who wants to really understand how this virtual world gets built, go look at the Unreal Engine 5 betas when they turned Lumen on, when you actually can, you're adjusting where the light's coming through the cave and the bounce is matching it in real time. And just 5 years ago in a 3D app, that was impossible to do that without adjusting the math and doing the volumetrics and adjusting how much the bounce was and the time of day, and you had to do all the math to do that. Now you just do it and go, oh, more or less bounce. Yeah, okay. and it's an entirely different kind of technology. And you look at what the Unreal Engine 5 is and how they're positioning it, it's fundamentally designed for what we do for a living.
It really is, yeah.
It's designed to take somebody's place. Set painters and builders. You know.
Yeah, so I guess it's exciting. It's really exciting for me being like I'm young. I'm 27. I've got a lot of time ahead of me. I'm really excited to see where it's going, but also a little bit like, I hope a robot doesn't take, the spot of a camera technician or a lens technician anytime soon. You know what I mean?
Well, yeah, there will be that. And it's interesting because, you look at it, I tell people now, they ask me, well, what kind of coding should I learn how to do? I said, if you're not learning game engines, you're behind this curve. I mean, I'm sitting here learning, extended data and all of that, but in the background, I've got my PCs running game stuff so I can learn a game engine just to have a fundamental knowledge of how it works. I have a degree in programming that I got a couple of lifetimes ago, and that I don't use for anything anymore. But it's one of those things that I'm just fascinated by it because I want to see where the future is. My job is to see all of this and understand it. And if you're not sticking your head in every little corner of the room, you miss something. And that's why this is fun, because I get to see things that other people don't.
Absolutely. Well, Gary, thank you so much for your time. This has definitely been an educational discussion for sure, in terms of what the future looks like. What tools and resources are out there to the filmmakers, to the creators, to make their jobs easier. What does that look like on a short-term basis and on a long-term basis? And it's all very fascinating. Gary, if we wanted to get in touch, or if we wanted to find out more about you or find some of these things, is there a good place for us to reach? I know.
I'm online, Gary Adcock at Instagram and Twitter. My blog is garyadcock.com, so I'm pretty easy. You can always reach me at Gary at Studio 37. So I like to have fun with this, and I'm thanks for asking. This was a lot of fun, and it's enjoyable for me to be able to share not just some of the knowledge, but some of the future too. And I thank everybody.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Well, with that, we'll wrap it up. So thanks to everybody who's watching live on our YouTube and Facebook channels. And thanks for the team here for the thoughtful questions and the preparation. And looking forward to having another one of these speaker series meetings here shortly. So thank you all, and go have a safe rest of your day or rest of your evening, wherever you may be.
Thanks.
Great.
Thank
Thanks
you,
for
Gary.
joining, everyone. Thank you, Gary.
Take care.